And I'm going to start with Epstein, and we're going to get into stories that aren't Epstein. But I think it's incumbent upon us to not forget that story, because it's going to come back, and it's not going to go away. And as it really, let's tie it in. Let's make the layup segue here as it pertains to authoritarianism, as it pertains to absolute power that this president seeks constantly. How is this case being handled under that prism?
Well, interestingly, Trump the other day asserted not just, which got a lot of attention, that Obama and Biden and Clinton had fabricated the files that he has been screaming about for years need to be made public, but he also asserted that, gee, if there are really files, why didn't they make them public? Which tells you about his mindset, that the government is not here to seek justice, but it is to instead serve the interests of the authoritarian leader. And it's very important this story be kept alive with new revelations, with asking questions that aren't at the moment being asked, and new ones, because otherwise we will never get the material here. Now, the Trump administration pulled what they thought was a pretty slick move, and to those who don't know the law, it probably was. They asked a federal judge to release grand jury transcripts, knowing perfectly well that it was highly unlikely that would happen. But more importantly, those grand jury transcripts were from the indictments of Epstein and his procurer and fellow rapist, Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell. Sorry, the heat's getting to me a little bit.
To forget the name.
And of course, those grand jury transcripts would have nothing to do with Donald Trump, because they were indictments sought of the other two people, not Trump. What we haven't seen are, among other things, the transaction records. Senator Wyden, the senior senator from Oregon, says that there are more than 4,500 wire transfers involving Epstein and Russian banks. Not all banks, just Russian banks. And of course, we know Russian banks are used all the time for criminal behavior, because Vladimir Putin's oligarchs are the biggest, best funded criminal gang in the world. Epstein held himself out to be a financier. Well, where are the trading records? Where are the monthly statements sent to Leslie Wexner, the founder of the Limited, who was his initial and by far biggest client, as best we know? What kind of returns did he earn if, in fact, he was actually, Epstein was actually a financier rather than an extortionist and a rapist? I mean, there are lots of avenues to pursue here, and keeping this story alive is critical. And then the question I think that's most important to ask is, gee, Donald, after you said you'd make all of these public if you became president, and now you're saying, oh no, we can't do that to protect the innocent. You can redact the names. It doesn't take that long, contrary to the claim that has been made, that you referenced a few minutes ago. Just remove everything that doesn't refer to Donald Trump, Melania Trump, the Trump organization, and let's see those records. Let's see what was on the CDs. Apparently, there were numerous video and image recordings of wealthy men engaged in sex with girls as young as 12. Some of these young women have a lawyer. Katie Johnston has been interviewed on video. You can see that on the internet, telling about what happened to her. And we have other young women who have spoken up. So there's lots here. And the core question is this: is the President of the United States a serial child rapist? There's an enormous amount of smoke pointing in that direction, no fire. But that's because we don't have the documents and we haven't gotten the right witnesses. Of course, if you don't want to know something, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, right. Or as I like to call them, sightless sheriffs who look the other way. But if you want to find out and you've got subpoena power, it's entirely doable. And so I would call upon Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, and Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in Manhattan, where a lot of the rape took place, to pursue their own investigations into what went on and what was Trump's involvement and what are the interests and the positions of the victims or survivors of this long-running operation to identify and rape young women. And of course, remember, Donald has many, many times comments about things like a 10-year-old girl he said he'd be dating in 10 years. When his second daughter, Tiffany, was in diapers, he was asked on a TV show, do you see anything of yourself or your spouse in little Tiffany? And he caught it at her legs and then cupped his hands over his chest and said, of course, we won't know how big these will be for a number of years. I mean, who says that about a baby girl in diapers, but someone who has a very sick mind? And given his walking in,
He also said, if I'm not mistaken, that about Ivanka, that he would date her if she wasn't her daughter.
Yes, and if you go on a Google image search and type in Trump parrot Ivanka, you will see a huge number of pictures that, in the words of many people I've shown them to, have Donald inappropriately touching his daughter.
Jeez. Yeah. So, yeah. Now, let me ask you a procedural question after on something you just said. Because there are Republicans, because there are MAGA people who are upset by this, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Is getting Tish James and Alvin Bragg in there looking for partisanship, looking for something to be partisan when it may not have to be, and maybe seeing this through another avenue might be the best way?
Well, I think that what matters is that we find out what's in the evidence that's already been collected. I mean, there's no shortage of material here. The inventories from the search warrants executed on Epstein's properties, the one virtually next door to Mar-a-Lago, his huge townhouse apartment that at one time was the most expensive residence in Manhattan, and in the Virgin Islands, are full of documentation. The Virgin Islands, has reached a large settlement with the estate. They have records. You haven't seen, you're not going to see Pam Bondi, the utterly corrupt attorney general, who was the utterly corrupt attorney general of Florida when much of this went on, and she did nothing when it was going on, produce any kind of investigation. I mean, this is the important thing about authoritarianism. Trump has created a protection racket. So what we need to do is break through that protection racket, because Donald Trump can survive being a liar, being a cheat, being all sorts of things, but I don't think he can survive actual evidence that he is a serial child rapist.
Yeah, I agree that would be, and we heard Joe Rogan even say that's a line in the sand that can't be crossed. And if that is in fact what comes out of this, we'll see. But of course, Pam Bondi was handpicked, knowing that this stuff wasn't going to go away, and that's part of her charge. And to go to
and Michael, I think it's important to point out that among the extreme Christian nationalists, they could live with this. They don't see anything wrong with that. They think that girls should be married off as soon as they have their first period. They have no problem with a child marriage. We had a discussion in one of the court classes I took today about Supreme Court decisions about wife beating. And I talked with a judge who was a domestic court judge in Texas, and how there were fellow judges who thought that, husbands are entitled to beat their wives and rape them. Not in New York State where I live, that's a crime. Yeah, but we need to keep in mind that there are actually people who would find this acceptable. I don't think, though, the vast majority would find this something they can live with. And when I say survive, I mean Donald Trump being removed from office. I don't mean anything more than that.
Right, of course, survive politically, and the MAGA movement were to survive politically. And we don't know who that baton would be passed to, but it would not be a baton you'd want if he is in fact found guilty of these things and did these things. You mentioned the Supreme Court. Ghislaine Maxwell went going to the Supreme Court now to try and get her conviction overturned because she said it violated a plea deal that was made by Epstein, that she was then immune from any kind of prosecution. I don't know if
there is such a deal. That is a reasonable interpretation of the deal, which on its face was unconscionable. So there's also a legal doctrine known as unconscionability. And so I can see some of the Supreme Court justices going along with her, but I have a hard time seeing 5 of them doing so. But the underlying issue is Donald Trump has said again and again and again that, there are these files and he would make them public as soon as he got back to the White House. Well, you're back in the White House. Let's see the files. Just walk your talk. And nobody should give up on this, especially White House journalists. Every new item. I mean, one of the things about Watergate, which most Americans didn't live through because it was 50 years ago, was the story didn't die. The Washington Post, the LA Times, sometimes ahead of the Washington Post, and the New York Times, and CBS all kept coming up with new stuff. And it kept that story alive when the public didn't care until we got to the point where we got irrefutable evidence that Richard Nixon was in fact a crook. And I'm not talking about the tax cheating part. He was pardoned and didn't have to stand trial for. One of his tax advisors went to prison for that. But the obstruction of justice that finally came out after a unanimous Supreme Court said he couldn't withhold tape recordings. And that's the same story here fundamentally. We got to keep this going. The Democrats in Congress needs to keep coming up with new ways to find this. The handful of Republicans who are demanding action on this, they need to be listened to. And I think there should be a serious effort by journalists. I just talked to one today who works for a major publication and said, you need to go to this lawyer who was on Lawrence O'Donnell a couple of nights ago, who represents over 200 of the young women, and talk with him. Now, the young women, they don't want to come out and be public. Understandable, given the doxing and the threats to lives and the threats by crazies in the MAGA movement. But there's lots of ways to get information out without releasing the names and identities of those young women and where they are today. But what do they say in affidavits under pseudonyms like Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 200?
Right. That's clearly important stuff. And, I want to ask you this. When I was covering this last election and going to MAGA Trump rallies all over the country during the election, I probably went to the last cycle, probably about 30 of them. And I'd be outside and I always said a lot of the people are there for the tailgate, but they weren't really there for the games. They liked the camaraderie. They liked all of that. When I would speak to some of these people, even then they were saying, if I find out that this stuff is true, then he would lose my support.
Right. And there's a lot of that. And that's part of the division you're seeing, because some of the people in MAGA are saying, wait a minute, you promised this stuff. Now, why are you withholding this? This doesn't make sense. And you can see how desperate Donald is, both by the angry reactions he's giving to questions, but also coming up with nonsense like these were fabricated. All these files were fabricated. Oh, okay. There's no client list. Well, you don't need a list to know who the clients were. You don't have to say, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have records of who visited, who made phone calls, who was at what events. And I think journalists should be very tough with any politician who wants to protect the privacy of someone in a case that there's clear evidence from the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell and the death of Epstein, along with things that have been put in the public record, that this was an organized, ongoing criminal conspiracy involving a vast sum of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, even more than $1 billion, to identify vulnerable and very cute 12, 13, 14, up to 18-year-old girls to be used for the pleasure of wealthy men who were friends of Epstein.
Yeah. It's a remarkable thing. One of the things that and I want to play this, Tony, for David, is the president talking about Epstein when he was in Scotland just now. This was over the weekend, so I don't know the exact date. But let's take a listen to the president answering a question from a reporter here.
That's such old history, very easy to explain, but I don't want to waste your time by explaining it. But for years, I wouldn't talk to Jeffrey Epstein. I wouldn't talk because he did something that was inappropriate. He hired help. And I said, don't ever do that again. He stole people that worked for me. I said, don't ever do that again. He did it again. And I threw him out of the place, persona non grata. I threw him out, and that was it.
And implicit in that is a relationship that they had when he said he didn't have a relationship with him.
Right.
He finds the most inappropriate thing that Jeffrey Epstein ever did was hire away some staff from him when we're talking about, pedophilia and sex trafficking here.
Well, I believe at least one of the people he hired away was one of the underage women who was then trafficked. And remember that the only comment Donald made before this about Ghislaine Maxwell after her conviction was to say, I wish her well. I'm sorry, Michael, can you imagine what would have happened if Barack Obama asked, what do you think of this convicted sex trafficker and rapist? And he had said, well, I wish her well.
Right.
I
can't believe it. Just as I can't believe when he's asked a few times whether or not he would consider pardoning her. Right. Or he said, I could. I don't know.
Because what's going on here actually in the meeting between Trump's personal lawyer, who's now number 2 at the Justice Department, and Ghislaine Maxwell in a closed meeting that we don't have access to, where more than 100 people, presumably most or all of them men, were brought up, is very clear. Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyer has said she wants a pardon or clemency. This is so facially corrupt.
Yeah.
That you can love Donald Trump and still have principles. And that's the issue here. I mean, do we have principles? Are we going to enforce principles? One of the unfortunate things that seems to be pretty well ingrained in human beings is that, of course, if you like someone, you tend to excuse what they've done. If you don't, you tend to go after them. This isn't even in a gray zone of, is this acceptable conduct? Unless you're part of this extreme movement that believes that beating your wife and marrying 10-year-old children is okay. Unless you're part of that little fringe group, this is not okay with 98, 99% of Americans. And so that keep the story alive, keep the pressure on. That's what matters.
Yeah. And somebody asked me when I was saying, not as well as you just said it, but saying sort of the same idea. Well, what difference does it make, right? What difference does it make? He's already won his election. He can't, according to the Constitution, if not himself, can't run again. What are we doing this for now? And
well, that's here's why we're doing that. Because we're supposed to be a nation of laws, not men. I warned people as early as 2011 that if Trump got to the White House, he would never leave peacefully. And what did he say recently this year was the only mistake he's ever made in his life? I shouldn't have left the White House in 2021. What makes you think, or anybody think, Donald is not going to try to stay on as president of the United States permanently? He asserts, this is his words, not mine. I have an Article 2 that says I can do anything I want. Article 2 of the Constitution says nothing of the kind. He is busy telling football or commercial sports teams how to name the teams. He is telling universities what you may and may not teach. This is not the action of a president who executes the laws. These are the actions of a dictator. And that's right now, we do not live in a free country. We live in a dictatorship. Trump has not yet fully consolidated his power. And if the Epstein story comes out fully, it isn't just Donald Trump can't stay in the White House. Neither can Pam Bondi. Neither can Kash Patel. Neither can the appointees at the Justice Department who are systematically turning it into a law firm on behalf of Donald Trump to prosecute those people he dislikes. All of that will come apart And so, and I've said to several journalists I know, since, at 76, I'm not in the middle of the ball game anymore. You should be asking the Virgin Islands people for the records. You should be asking the lawyer who represents the 200 or so young women what he can release. You should be scouring every place and document you can, and you should be asking for the financial records about this. And at some point, there will be enough evidence that some of the key Republicans on Capitol Hill will back off.
Right. That's key. That's what people need to understand. I'm so glad you put it so well. You answered the question. The other thing that in terms of manipulating, when we talk about dictatorship and fascism, you try and dismantle your enemies. The other day I said on a different show that the reason he's going after Barack Obama for treason may be because what you do is you dismantle your enemy at all costs, no matter what. And if he fancies himself as someone who's going to stay in the White House or could run again, well, that would mean that Barack Obama could run again too. But if he's treasonous and he is in jail or it carries the death penalty federally, treason does if convicted. So if you do that, that's part of what you're talking about too.
Yeah, they're never going to actually go forward with this. I don't believe that. If they do, it's going to blow up in their face. But people should know something very important. Under our Constitution, it is impossible for Barack Obama to have committed treason. If Donald Trump actually has given methods and sources to the Russians, as they've indicated he has, and as other foreign intelligence agencies have indicated has happened, he can't be charged with treason either, because we have to be in a state of war. The U.S. was last in a congressionally declared state of war in December of 1945. It was 4 months after the Japanese surrendered that the last belligerent surrendered to the United States. So it's been now almost 80 years since we've been in a state of war. And secondly, you have to be engaged in an enemy. We're not at war, so we don't have enemies under the law. Engaged with an enemy against the United States or waging war in the United States. Now we had U.S. federal judges who went to work for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and one of them was later removed from office because he literally used his judicial powers to wage war on the United States. So there's no way you can make and sustain such a charge under our Constitution.
Okay. And again, these are the sorts of things a Trump administration would do. Sow the seeds of doubt. But of course, you can't do the things that you're talking about doing. Before I let you go, David, I want to ask you quickly. We were talking about, you're an educator. You know what's going on. You referred to it. Harvard now saying that they're going to possibly pay $500 million. Columbia's paid $200 million. My alma mater, University of Virginia, has their president resigned because of the DEI stuff. Jim Ryan did what I think was the right thing, even though I love the guy. But what should Harvard do? What can we see here that we should be fighting in your estimation?
Yeah. Number one rule, Professor Timothy Snyder, the great the scholar of authoritarianship, says, is you do not voluntarily comply. Harvard has an endowment of more than $50 billion. Harvard should take an absolutely firm stance that we're not submitting to this. And at the end of the day, if they win in court and get all their money restored, it hasn't cost them anything. But this is when you reach into your endowment to stand up for principle. We would be in a much better situation if Columbia University hadn't immediately caved when the Trump administration came after them. Now, lawyers, civil lawyers, are going to advise, well, if you can get out of this for $250 million, that's a bargain. You should do it, because their algebra is the costs of this, the costs of litigation and the financial penalties. The problem is, Donald Trump is not going to stop and go away and suddenly go, oh, yes, kumbaya, Harvard, I love you now. Harvard, which, by the way, rejected him to be a student. And Donald harbors grudges. Trust me, 37 years of covering Donald, one of the things I early learned was how much he harbors, he lets things fester inside for years. Harvard should stand up. Other universities should stand up, and they should say, no, we are not going to knuckle under to this illegal activity, which is what it is. And Trump is, not spending money Congress directed. Well, we dealt with this under Nixon. He tried to do what was called impound the money. That was his euphemism for not doing what Congress said. He is trying to not fund universities. But if Congress has appropriated this money, then the argument should be you are required to do so. You took an oath to faithfully execute the office of the president, and that office's duty is primarily to do whatever Congress tells you to do. You're simply the executive for the branch that decides what to do. Trump, of course, is trying in every way possible to avoid accountability for anything he does, including going after individual federal judges. They just went after Judge Boasberg for what they say was an inappropriate comment he made. Read the quote in the news stories. It is actually a 100% appropriate comment for a federal judge to make, expressing his concern about the rule of law. So I think the universities and other institutions need to stand up, and there will be some damage along the way. It's going to hurt. Bad things are going to happen. But if you don't stand up, he just accrues more power, and then he'll come back after you again with something new.
Yep. And and what he's doing is sort of one of the earmarks of fascism, and go after the institutions of higher learning.
We also need to get people to know what that word means, Michael. People do not know what the word fascism means.
Yeah, and so they should look that up. Maybe even look that up before you Google Donald Ivanka Parrot. I think maybe go to fascism first and learn about that. So David K. Johnston, continue enjoying your retreat. And we hope that the trip to Civil Rights South was profitable, because it's a really important thing to see. I'm glad you went down.
Unsettling but deeply informing. Take care,
Michael. And I would say also impressive that what Alabama does to keep those the memories of the civil rights movement alive. There are a lot of things to criticize about Alabama, but they've done, I think, a wonderful job of memorializing that period.
Yep, I agree. Take care, Michael. Bye, folks.
Take care.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.